KrisAnne Hall is an attorney and former prosecutor who travels the country teaching the Constitution and the history that gave us our founding documents. KrisAnne will connect the dots for you like no one else can. As host of the KrisAnne Hall Show, she pulls no punches, puts liberty first, and gives no quarter to those who hide behind party labels. KrisAnne will tell you what the founders had to say on today's relevant issues. She is an author of Not a Living, Breathing Document, Reclaiming Our Constitution, and the DVD series The Roots of Liberty for Junior Patriots. She's a multiple award winner for her patriotism. KrisAnne is an incredibly passionate speaker, a true Patrick Henry of our time. She speaks to audiences all across the country on constitutional history, American exceptionalism, and the fight for liberty. Her passion and enthusiasm are contagious. See for yourself as we welcome to the stage KrisAnne Hall.
Good evening, everybody. How are you this evening? Blessed to live in America. I want to mention to you, I think it's totally and completely unfair to have me come out after Miss Debbie sings that song, because I'm welling up in the back and I'm like, I gotta go talk to these people with tears streaming down my face. But you see, I think we're here because we do love America. And I think we're here because we love God. But those things go together though, don't they? How many of you believe that liberty is a gift from God? If you believe that liberty is a gift from God, then you cannot believe that government gave you liberty. You cannot believe that the Constitution of the United States gives you liberty. You cannot believe that the Bill of Rights gives you rights. And since you know these things, that God gave you liberty and that God is the provider of your rights, then we have a greater responsibility to God than we do to government. But we're kind of not living up to that, are we? So many things that we battle today. I think one of the greatest things that we battle is ignorance. Samuel Adams said, "No people will tamely surrender their liberties when knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved. But to the contrary, when we become universally ignorant and debauched in our manners, we will sink underneath our own weight without the aid of foreign invaders." May I mention to you that America has been sinking long before ISIS, because we have forgotten that there is a price to be paid for the liberty we possess, and that price requires an attitude and an action of eternal vigilance. I want to just let you know, the introduction talked a little bit too much about me, but said something like, I pull no punches. I want you to realize that I don't mince words, and I'm here to give you the truth, because we have got to start loving the truth instead of the lies. And we have to be willing to accept that truth, even when it might rock the very foundations of things that we have believed all our lives. And so I might tell you a few things that might be a little shocking, but I want you to know something very important. The truth is not fair and balanced. And I think we should have a little bit more truth and a whole lot less fairness around today. So what we're going to do today is we're going to teach some things that we haven't taught for generations, things that we have forgotten. Number one, our Constitution is under attack. How do you all know that, right? Our Constitution is under attack. But how many of us stand up on a daily basis in the public forum defending our Constitution? My goodness, how many of us stand up to our city council, our county commission, our state reps, our sheriff, much less our federal representatives, and show them and teach them how they're supposed to be defending the Constitution as they did in their oath? Raise your hand if you do that every day, once a week, once a month. You see, voting does not preserve your liberty. Voting is your minimum responsibility as members of a republic. And so what I want to do is I want to teach you some things to overturn the lies that we've been hearing about our Constitution. Number one, our Constitution was not written in 1787. Our Bill of Rights was not written in 1789. The Declaration of Independence was not written in 1776. As a matter of fact, there is absolutely nothing new, nothing novel, nothing invented in any of these documents, but these documents are the product of over 700 years of time-tested, blood-bought principles. Over those 700 years, 5 documents were written. Our framers called them Liberty Charters. It was their constitution as citizens of the Empire of Great Britain. I call them the genealogy of the Constitution. Because without these 5 documents, we would have no Declaration of Independence, no Constitution, no Bill of Rights, and if we did, they would look totally different. And I want to tell you that I know history, and I'm pretty sure without these 5 documents, we would be in a kingdom of the United States rather than a constitutional republic. How many of you remember from your history lessons that shortly after we concluded our first war for independence with Great Britain, there were people begging George Washington to be king? Can we all say, praise God, there were some people who realized that the king thing doesn't work out so well? So I want to show you some things here from our framers, some things that we need to understand from a fundamental perspective. This is James Madison, and James Madison said, in a word, as a man has said to have a right to his property, he may be equally said to have a property in his rights. Madison wants us to remember and know in our minds that our right to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, press, our right to keep and bear arms, our right to due process are just as tangible as the physical property on which your house sits. And if you would not let the government show up on your doorstep with a copy of your survey of your property and say, well, you know, we've been looking at your property today and we've decided these survey lines need to be reinterpreted. And we're going to reinterpret your property lines because, you know, it was written a long time ago, and property lines mean something different than they did when they wrote your property document, and we're just going to move them in about 100 feet on all sides. How many of you would accept that? So why do we accept the Supreme Court doing that with our speech and our religion and our press? Because we do not realize that our rights are tangible. And I don't know if the people realize I just lost my clock, which means I could go on for about 6 hours. John Adams wrote in 1765, "Liberty must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker." That's simply a simple explanation of natural law. We are created in the image of God, Genesis says, and because we are created in the image of God, we've inherited certain things from God. One thing that we've inherited from God is freedom. God's the most free being in the universe. Raise your hand if it's your job to wake up every day and tell God how to run things. This is usually where the husbands look at their wives because that's what you think we do. We tell you what to do. We must be telling God as well. But no, we don't tell God what to do. Nobody does. We've inherited that freedom, but we don't want to live in a place where people are free. That's not sarcasm, that's realism. Because if we live in a place where people are free, that means I'm free to lie, I'm free to steal, and I'm free to murder. I am I'm free to do whatever I want to do regardless of how that hurts you. Is that a place you want to live in? No. Because you see, liberty must be supported at all hazards, not freedom. Liberty and freedom are not the same thing. Liberty is freedom plus morality. That shared morality that says, I am free to lie and steal and murder, but I will not because it's wrong. How many of you know laws don't stop crimes? I wish our legislators understood that. Because you see, the only thing that will stop someone from doing something wrong is knowing that it's wrong. And it's about time Christians stop passing laws and start spreading the gospel along with the Holy Spirit. Adam says, we have this liberty from our Maker, but he also says, but if we had not, our fathers have bought and purchased it for us with their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood, because liberty comes at a price. The history of our Constitution reaches back 700 years before the writing of the Declaration of Independence, because we were all British. How many of you realize everybody who lived in the first 13 colonies were British? Paul Revere did not ride through the colonies yelling, "The British are coming," because that would have been ridiculous. He was British. They were yelling, "The regulars are coming," because that's what they called the government forces. And our history, the beginnings of our Constitution begin in British legal history. Begin with this guy, Ethelred. You see, before 1014, the Anglo-Saxons were governing themselves in small communities, quite successfully. So successfully that they had outside kingdoms looking in and saying, hey, those Anglo-Saxons are doing a pretty good job on their own, but they have a problem. They don't have a king. They must need one. And so the Anglo-Saxons were continually being bombarded with battles from foreign kingdoms to assume them in and kings to take over. And they had a problem because they're in small communities and they didn't have cell phones and text messaging. So when the foreign kings came in with their troops, they were having a hard time organizing themselves for their common defense. Not only that, in order to prevent a war or to end a war or to have good relationships with foreign kings, you have to be able to negotiate with them. How many of you think that kings are going to negotiate well with common men? So with no king, they couldn't engage in any treaties or foreign affairs. So they went to Ethelred and they said to Ethelred, your family had been king over the Anglo-Saxons when we had kings back in the day. We'll allow you to be our king on one condition. Your only job will be to represent our small communities in foreign affairs for war, peace, negotiations, and foreign commerce. You will leave us alone to govern ourselves. Now, if we'd been teaching the Constitution the way we were supposed to all our lives, everybody in this room would be going, oh, I see. Because that is the exact same agreement that the states made when they created the central government through the Constitution. James Madison wrote in Federalist Papers 45, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. He says the powers delegated by the Constitution to the federal government are limited to external objects. That's founders speak for foreign affairs. And then he doesn't wait for the Supreme Court to define his words for us. He tells us exactly what external objects means. He says war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. And then says every other power, down to the prosperity, the property, and the lives of the people, is reserved to the states. The very same agreement made in 1014, not invented. Problem is, you start calling someone a king, don't be surprised when he starts acting like one. And when people start looking to government to be their provider, don't be surprised when they start acting like subjects. And all we have to do is fast forward 30 years. We have a brand new king. His name is Edward the Confessor, and the people love him. They are calling him a generous king. Now, under the Ethelred Agreement, the king has no ability to be generous because that's not a foreign affair. But people like free stuff. Problem is, Edward's about to die and he has no heir to the throne. That means a cousin is going to be king, a cousin by the name of William I. Problem is, the Anglo-Saxons do not want William I to be king because William I is not Anglo-Saxon. He's from Normandy. Anglo-Saxon kings operate under what we call a limited monarchy, the original Ethelred Agreement, but Norman kings are completely unlimited in their power, your stereotypical king. And the Anglo-Saxons do not want a foreign leader over their kingdom. Can you imagine that? So they hatch out this plan to appoint a guy named Harold to be king. Harold was Edward's right-hand man. He's Anglo-Saxon. He's going to do what Edward did. Problem is, the year is 1066, and we don't appoint kings and we don't elect them. And William gets wind that they're going to pass him over as king, and he is not happy, which is very bad news for the Anglo-Saxons because William has a nickname. He's called William the Conqueror. What do you suppose happens when you make a guy mad whose nickname is the Conqueror? He raises his Norman army, he goes over and defeats Harold and the English people and makes himself king. But now William gets the surprise because he wants to rule as a Norman king with unlimited power, but the people are expecting him to be limited. Now, kings carry a unique power of decree. They can issue laws that are legally binding on the people. And William knows all he has to really do, legally speaking, is to simply step up and say, I am king now. I will issue by decree that we will now operate as a Norman kingdom and not an Anglo-Saxon one. But there's a problem. Let me ask you a question. When you don't like your king, do you start a recall petition to remove him from the throne? Do you find a new king to run against him in the next kingly election? What do you do when you don't like your king? Right, you have to have a rebellion and you have to chop off his head. William is a little fond of his head and realizes that if he steps up and issues this decree after just conquering the people to become king, he's quite likely going to meet his own demise. So instead, he thinks it would be better for himself to simply fundamentally transform the kingdom in such a way that it becomes Norman rule without the people even knowing. Now, the big limiting factor in a monarchy, this limited Anglo-Saxon monarchy, is common law. So that's the first place William's going to attack. He starts replacing the judges in the common law system with judges who are not loyal to the common law, but loyal to the ideology of the king. He starts using those judges to enforce his foreign law on the people of the kingdom, even when it's contrary to their common law. He starts chasing the private landowners off of their lands through threat and force. Maybe they have a turtle extinction problem or a spotted owl they need to protect. But you see, there's something very interesting in a kingdom. When land becomes abandoned, the ownership of that land reverts back to the king. So William says, oh my golly, look at this. All this land that's coincidentally now abandoned is mine. And starts inviting all his foreign friends to come live in the kingdom. How else do you keep foreign law in a kingdom unless it's full of foreigners who like the foreign law better than the common law of the land? He starts chasing the leadership out of the churches and replacing them with people who are not loyal to the Word of God, but loyal to what? The ideology of the king. So now he can use the church to convince the people to do things even when it's contrary to the Word of God. Perhaps abortion. This transformation is going to take place over 30 years through the reign of William I and his son William II. But you'll notice they call him William the Red. Can you guess why? You'll notice that William II is only going to rule for about 13 years. They describe William as a wicked, evil king just like his father. And then one day, William II and his little brother, Henry I, go hunting together. And William II is killed in a mysterious hunting accident when a stray arrow from Henry's hunting party accidentally shoots William square in the eyeball. How many of you think that was an accident? Well, guess what? The Anglo-Saxons weren't buying the accident thing either, which made Henry on shaky ground, because even though they didn't like his brother, murdering your brother to become king does not make you a popular king. Because if you'll murder your brother, then what are the people to you? So Henry has to do some things to appease the people. One of the first things Henry does is he comes to the people and he says, look, I realize the circumstances surrounding the death of my brother seem a bit suspicious. So I want to put your minds at ease. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call together a group of 3 men. I'm going to choose 3 men to sit on a tribunal. We're even going to call it a grand tribunal. And these men are going to determine whether I'm at fault for the death of my brother or not. How do you suppose that works out when the government is investigating itself? Maybe they called it a congressional hearing. Guess what? Henry's not at fault for the death of his brother. Well, Henry's got to keep trying. He does a number of things, but the most important thing that Henry will do, Henry is going to sign the very first of our Liberty Charters, the very first of the documents in our genealogy. This one is called, right button, KrisAnne, the 1100 Charter of Liberties. It's Henry's promise to the people that government will never be evil and oppressive ever again. How's that working out for us? Henry he makes a list of 14 things that government can never do, because if they do them, then the people will know government's being evil and oppressive. I've given you an example here. If any of my baron or earl shall die, and the barons and the earls were the property owners. If any of my baron or earl shall die, his heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. Henry's simply saying is the heirs of an estate have to purchase their estate from the government before they can receive it. You have an evil and oppressive government. Ringing any bells? Isn't that exactly what inheritance tax is? Death tax? How is it that a king in 1100 knew that inheritance tax was the mark of an evil and oppressive government, and we allow our government to call it revenue? Well, Henry's not interested in liberty, he's interested in keeping his head. But the people now have a promise in writing from the king. This carpet is squishy up here. That government will never be evil and oppressive. And they're going to need that promise because in 100 years, they're going to have the most wicked king they've ever known. His name is John. John is a massive taxation king. And if you can't pay your taxes, which is highly likely, you're going to be arrested, thrown into prison, and mutilated. He's cutting off hands, feet, ears, cutting the tongues out of people who cannot afford to pay their taxes, and he's even going to execute them. They called him vicious and ruthless. As a matter of fact, I read one account where they said even hell was fouled by the presence of John. Makes him a pretty bad guy. You guys know John, by the way. You probably don't realize it. How many of you heard of a guy named Robin Hood? What are we taught, and I'm saying that very purposefully, what are we taught about Robin Hood that is supposed to make him famous? What are we taught that he did? Steal from the rich and give to the poor. How many of you know that our history is being rewritten in error? So are our legends. Robin Hood was not robbing from the rich to give to the poor in an effort to redistribute wealth. Robin Hood was taking from the king and the crown the money that had been stolen from the people through oppressive and unlawful taxation, returning it to the people so they could live. John's going to murder you if you can't pay your taxes. Robin Hood's not trying to put everybody on equal financial footing. He's giving people their lives back. He is not a socialist. He's a liberty fighter, because the first step to liberty is always a right to life. But guess what? Murdering people for not paying their taxes is not enough to bring the people to revolution. And governments have figured that out over the centuries. You see, if you can keep your population focused on stuff that they have, stuff that they see, stuff that they think they can get, government just needs to trickle down enough stuff to keep us happy subjects. The good news is that government always gets power drunk, thinking they can do anything and the people will never push back, and then they commit some fundamental error. John's fundamental error is this: the people have chosen a man named Stephen Langton to be their archbishop. John says, I don't like who this guy is. I'm going to pick the leader of your church. But John's already forgotten about the 1100 Charter of Liberties, because the very first promise Henry made in the 1100 Charter of Liberties was that the church will be completely free from government intrusion. That is the definition of separation of church and state. You see, Thomas Jefferson did not invent that phrase, separation of church and state. He was remembering his history lesson when Henry I said, if the government is in your church, it's an evil and oppressive government. A rebellion comes against John, bringing us the second document in our genealogy. This one's called the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is an amazing document. The 1100 Charter of Liberties, written by Henry and his people. But the Magna Carta is written by the people themselves. The Magna Carta is the people standing up and saying, hey, you made us a promise in 1100 that government would never be evil and oppressive. You obviously have no idea how to keep your promises. So now we, the people, are going to rise in our majesty, place ourselves above the king, and tell the king what he can and cannot do. The Magna Carta creates a royal council of men who sit in the court with the power over the king. Our 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th amendments in our Bill of Rights come from clauses 38 through 40 in the Magna Carta. We did not invent them, we inherited them. Clause 61 in the Magna Carta is where we get a very important provision of our First Amendment, the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of their grievances. Not an invention. Something inherited based on liberty as a gift from God. How many of you think that kings being told what to do by people is going to go over well? Well, now the Anglo-Saxons are literally going to have to fight for the next 400 years to make sure that they control their liberty and limit the government. So we'll fast forward to this gentleman, Charles I. Charles I is a handsome young man. He's king, and he is described as being a massive spending king. They say Charles loves to romp about Europe, spending on his every whim and fancy. Now, I don't know if they played golf in 1625, but apparently we've been paying for vacations for a really long time. Now, whose money is Charles spending? That's right, how is he collecting that money? Taxes. The problem is the Magna Carta says that there's no taxation without representation. That royal council is now called Parliament, and Parliament gets sick and tired of Charles' wasteful spending. he stands up to Charles and say, we're not going to pass any more of your laws until you get your spending under control. Can you imagine that? The legislative branch looking at the executive branch and saying, we're going to defund you until you get a proper budget. Novel idea, right? Charles says, okay, fine. But wait a minute. I'm king. What do I even need a parliament for? And he dissolves parliament. Now, he didn't have to call in the sergeant at arms to remove everybody from parliament. He could have simply stood up and said, if parliament won't legislate, then I'm just going to go ahead and regulate. Or maybe he held a State of the Kingdom address and said, if parliament will not pass laws, I will. After all, I have a quill and a messenger. Isn't that the same as dissolving parliament, declaring them to be irrelevant and powerless? And then if they act like it, they are, right? Well, Charles wants to keep collecting the people's money, but he realizes from John and the others, if you get too tyrannical too fast, they'll hold a sword at your throat. So he comes to the people and he says, look, I'm going to have to collect some money from you, and I know Parliament's not here. They were getting in the way of the efficient operation of government anyway, and so I want to just put your minds at ease. I'm going to be collecting some money from you. No, it's not going to violate the Magna Carta because it's not a tax. I'm going to call it a forced loan. And the people stand up and say, tax, mandate, we don't care what you call it. This is a violation of our liberty. This is a violation of our Constitution, and we will not comply. A sword comes to Charles' throat, and Charles signs our third document, the Petition of Right of 1628. Now, they let Charles stay king. Maybe they thought he learned his lesson. Maybe not. Because it doesn't take Charles long before he's back to business as usual, dictating to the church what they should and should not say. A beautiful woman by the name of Jetty Geddes in Scotland gets sick and tired of hearing the king's propaganda from her pastor's mouth. So she steps up in the middle of church, screaming things about heretics selling their soul to the crown, and throws her stool at the pulpit, which spills out into the streets, spreads all over the kingdom, and starts the bishop wars. And now Charles has got problems at home. But see, Charles wants to keep spending the people's money, but he's realized, I can't whim and fancy it. I've got to have a good excuse. Good news is for Charles, the years between 1628 and 1641 provide him with that perfect excuse. Because you see, these are very violent times. There are wars everywhere. And Charles comes to his people and he says, hey, you guys see that over there? You see all those wars going on in our neighbors' yards? I need to ask you a very important question. Do you want those wars to come to our kingdom? Well, of course you don't. And I got good news, because I've got a perfect plan. And you really don't have to do anything. All you have to do is give me your tax dollars. And I'll make sure all our allies are adequately funded in these foreign wars. And if they have all the money and they're superior in power and superior in strength, then they will win those wars over there. And if they win the wars over there, then what? They end over there, right? See, I told you it was perfect. It's just a matter of national security that you pay your taxes. But the people are watching Charles and they're noticing Charles is not funding their allies. Charles is funding their enemies. He's made a deal with the enemies. I help you win, you come over here and help me get my people back under subjection. Charles is brought up on charges of treason, found guilty, and sentenced to death. A process which gives us our fourth document, the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. The Grand Remonstrance of 1641 says, the root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design, subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom. So what does that mean to us today? Modern day translation simply means, we've been watching tyrannical government for 600 years and we're noticing a pattern. The same bag of tricks over and over again, whose only purpose is to steal our liberty. And when you read the Grand Remonstrance, you see the plan: corruption of the court system, infiltration of foreign law, the government diminishing the property rights of the people, the government taking control of the church, the government creating fiat money to control the monetary system, and the government disarming the people while the government remained armed. We wouldn't know anything about that now, would we? Well, we chopped off his head, and it only took a few more years before we had a brand new king, same old design. This one is James II, and James II has figured out he can take anything that he wants from the people as long as he gives them something to distract them. And he steps before the people and says, I'm going to issue a decree to give you something you've never had before. I'm going to give you religious liberty. You see, you no longer have to be a member of the Church of England. You can have church anywhere you want, with any pastor you want, preach anything you want, anytime you want, and the government will not persecute you or prosecute you on one condition. Before you have church, you must inform the king where you'll be meeting, when you'll be meeting, who will be preaching, what will be said, and you must promise that you will never say anything bad about the king in church. See, because that doesn't sound like religious liberty to me. That sounds like a 501c3. So what's the difference between 2015 and 1688? In 1688, the bishops stood up to the king and said, we have a promise over 500 years old that says we will be completely free from your intrusion. We're not following your decree, and we're going to do whatever we want anyway. James arrests them, throws them in prison, a new rebellion forms, and we get the fifth document, the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Whereas the late King James II, by the assistance of evil judges, counselors, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of our kingdom. That word extirpate means to completely destroy. And they said what James was doing was completely destroying liberty. How many of you so far have seen history repeat? How many of you seen tyranny appear in the very same way today? The very principles of our Constitution developed over 700 years, and now I'm going to show you one more. They said James was completely destroying liberty by writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law, when that's a power reserved to Parliament alone. See, we didn't invent separation of powers. They had separation of powers in 1688. Separation of powers says you have three branches: the executive branch and the king, the legislative branch and parliament, and the judicial branch. They cannot share power and they cannot steal power. And when the executive branch is writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law, when that is a power reserved to the legislative branch alone, in 1688, they knew the only result could be the complete destruction of liberty, and that was grounds for war. How is it that a people in 1688 with no internet, no cell phones, no CNN, MSNBC, or Fox knew that executive orders were the complete destruction of liberty, and today our parliament, our Congress, does nothing at all? Well, here you have now George III, who's not a brand new king doing a brand new thing. It's the same old king doing the same old design, because the Boston Tea Party was not about taxes. Our Declaration of Independence was not about taxes. You got to get to the 17th grievance before you see the word taxation. Our independence from Great Britain was over legislation without representation, over warrantless searches, mandated purchases, denial of due process, and being subject to foreign courts and foreign law. The same old malignant and pernicious design. So when our framers got together and they were saying, George, be king, we ought to be grateful that some people realized that kings only keep their promises as long as you hold a sword to their throat. And the minute you drop the sword, they go back to being kings and people go back to being subjects. Because in a kingdom, the king holds all the power, hands out all the privileges to the people as he sees fit. And if he's handing them out, what can he do? Take them away. They said, no, no, no. Our primary purpose is the preservation of liberty. Our Constitution says the reason we formed this union was to preserve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. We must have a constitutional republic where the people hold all the rights and we delegate to government the power that we see fit. Jefferson said, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. And if we're delegating power, what can we do? Take it back. Whenever any government, any form of government operates contrary to those means, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish them. We are a constitutional republic. We are not a democracy. Do you know that Thomas Jefferson was a liberal? So was James Madison. So was John Locke. That word liberal in their day meant someone who believed that liberty was a gift from God. Words have changed meanings, that is true. So has the word democracy. When you see our framers talk about a democracy, they're talking about power from the people, the demos plus the kratos. But the modern day definition of democracy is mob rule. And there is no difference between a democracy and a kingdom. The only difference between a democracy and a kingdom is how many people rule over you. And if we live in a democracy, that means the majority rules over the minority, and the minority never has anything unless the majority says so. Democracies do not ensure liberty. They only ensure that there'll always be rulers and slaves. Liberty must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker, but guess what that means? To whom much is given, much is required. Not only do we have this right given to us by God, but we have a duty and a responsibility to prosper and preserve it. Have you read the parables of the talents? When the master gives a gift, he returns with a day of reckoning. And he demands that the gift that he's given you is not buried in the dirt and presented back to him in the same way it's given. He says, no, you are supposed to prosper the gifts that we've been given. And that is our responsibility. Liberty is freedom plus morality, because laws can't change the heart, only the Holy Spirit. This is how you get in touch with me. How many of you realize this is not what we're teaching in our schools today? I have a book table out there where you can get this lesson that I just taught you for your high school, middle school students, and for everybody younger. I also have a DVD set, almost 6 hours of training. I do a 6-hour workshop on the weekends, and this is a 3 DVD set that carries that 6 hours of training in 40-minute segments, so you don't have to watch it the whole time, all the way through. This book I have is how do you take the rights that we have, primarily the First Amendment, and turn it into a tool to preserve liberty? How do you gather that courage to stand and make a statement in preservation of liberty? And tomorrow, I will be teaching the lesson in this book. How many of you saw history repeat? You see now where our Constitution came from. It cannot be a living, breathing document that is up to interpretation to modern standards, because it is not a codified law. It is a document built on time-tested, blood-bought principles. And go look up that word in the dictionary. The word principle cannot change. Because if it's a principle and it changes, it's no longer a principle, it's just a guideline. Daniel Webster said, "Is the Constitution worth preserving?" Well, is it? He said, then guard it as you would at the very seat of your life. He said, guard it not only against the open blows of violence, but also against that spirit of change. He said, miracles do not cluster, but that which has happened but once in 6,000 years may never happen again. And such a government, once destroyed, would leave a void to be filled, perhaps with centuries of riot, despotism, tumult, and revolution. I want to ask you a question. What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind for your children? Because the job of preserving liberty is up to us. And liberty is a gift that we pay forward. Our ignorance is causing our children to have to buy back a liberty that should have been given to them. And they will not do it at the ballot box. They will do it with their blood. Let me mention to you, tomorrow we'll be teaching our founders' solution to the federal government problem. How many of you think the federal government is completely out of control? After seeing this lesson tonight, would it surprise you to find out that our founders actually anticipated the federal government that we have today? They knew we would become pacified in prosperity. We would become lazy in luxury. And that's the moment government's waiting for. So within our constitutional republic, they gave us a solution. Because we are not a kingdom, we do not have to go to war and chop off heads. We have peaceful solutions to control our government and restore our constitutional republic. And you're going to have to come back tomorrow and find out how.